Now, our next speaker is somebody who I was sitting between Josh, who many of you will have met in the last couple of days. And I was sitting between Josh Wolfe and Joel Matthewson the other evening in the restaurant on Tuesday evening. And you've just heard what Joel had to say. We know that he's somebody who knows his stuff. And he was pointing at Josh and he was saying, this guy, he's really famous in America. He's a hero, yeah? To the extent that that now Josh is going to be featured on one of the media courses that I think Joel is going to be teaching. I'm not quite sure what the link-up is going to be, but it's certainly there. Josh's claim to fame derives from, I would guess, many things, but he's an independent filmmaker, a freelance journalist, and certainly in one of the stories he got involved in, he had the misfortune, he was brave enough and heroic enough not to reveal his sources, although he came under immense pressure. For some people, I'm sure, in the States, that made him notorious. Certainly, it meant that he paid a very high price. He ended up in prison for a good period of time. That's the story, in part, that Josh is going to be telling us now, I think. Yeah, Josh?
I'll touch on that. I had a chance to tell the story about going to prison earlier this week, so this is going to be slightly a different story, but we'll all tie it together. So good afternoon. Thanks so much for having me here. Today I'm going to be talking about why it's important for independent journalists and student reporters to be given the same protections as their professional peers. Now, it's generally understood that reporters are not given extra rights, and they certainly don't have a pass to break the law. But journalists often have legitimate reasons to venture into areas that they otherwise wouldn't, and to talk to people engaged in suspicious activities. Earlier this week, I spoke about how I found myself ensnarled in a legal battle with the federal government over the rights of a journalist to maintain control of their unpublished material after I was subpoenaed by a federal grand jury for a video of a protest that I produced for my blog. Now, after being released from prison, I eventually found myself working for a small daily newspaper in Palo Alto. And later, I enrolled at the UC Berkeley Graduate School of Journalism, which, I should point out, actually gave me the grant to cover my airfare to get here to allow me to speak today. So thank you so much, UC Berkeley School of Journalism. Now, while I was a student at Berkeley studying journalism in November of 2010, there was a proposed dramatic fee increase that sparked a series of protests, and the fee increase did go forward, a 33% increase if I remember correctly, that led to an occupation of an academic building. Now, after learning of the students' plans to sneak into the building, who would follow that story? I followed a group of students into Wheeler Hall, which was the largest academic building on campus, and I filmed them as they barricaded themselves inside and held fast onto the doors as dozens of police tried to get inside. But despite my presence as a journalist, a conduct panel found me responsible for violating the student code of conduct. The panel found that since there is no exception carved into the code for the student press, I should be held responsible for simply being inside the building. I was actually eventually found guilty of those charges, and my punishment was actually to research and develop a proposal that would protect the rights of journalists who may find themselves ensnared by the Office of Student Conduct for simply reporting about activities on campus. Now, for what it's worth, they actually originally were going to give me a warning and the assignment, and I said, but you just said I didn't do anything wrong, so why should I have a warning? This whole process took 18 months. My entire time in journalism school was spent fighting this thing that started off as a threat of suspension. They threatened to suspend me for 6 months for doing journalism while at journalism school. So during the hearing, the panel found that... So during the hearing, the panel found that I violated journalistic ethics because I spent part of my time inside the building working on a different reporting assignment I was writing at the time for my class. And let me just quote from the report that they issued. During the downtime, while the batteries were being charged, a journalist covering the Wheeler Hall occupation would have resorted to other means of reporting the protest. Mr. Wolfe could have interviewed the other students by other means, including pen and paper, if necessary. Instead of continuing in the role of journalist, Mr. Wolfe turned on his laptop and began working on a writing assignment for one of his courses. Again, this is journalism school, so it was a news story that I was working on. But let me go on. At this point, Mr. Wolf transitioned from the role of journalist to that of a student. And in this case, a student in protest within Wheeler Hall, said the hearing chair, optometry professor Robert DiMartino, in his report. The panel also found that I violated my journalistic responsibilities when I was looking out the window, taking pictures, and I spotted a classmate in the crowd gathered below, and they waved to me, and I waved back. And an AP photographer happened to snap a photograph just as I was waving, which was brought in as evidence. And the professor goes on to say, he, in fact, by virtue of these actions, became a participant in the story, and as such, a student protester. He was no longer detached and objective, but allowed himself to become part of the story he intended to cover. While objectively covering a story from a detached perspective might be the professor's definition of responsible journalism, it's clearly not the only one. Through the help of the Student Press Law Center and several friends and colleagues, I propose the university add the following to their code of conduct to help ensure that the rights of journalists would be respected. So I'll go ahead and read that to you. A, the university may not restrict students from freely publishing material in a lawful manner. While the university has a legitimate interest in reviewing academic work before it is published, this interest does not allow the university to exercise prior restraint over student media or prevent students from publishing that work independently. B, students are free to deal openly, fearlessly, and responsibly in reporting issues of interest and importance to the university community. Although students are not given any special rights under the code, it is understood that their reporting may take them to places and situations where they otherwise wouldn't go. And while no student is allowed to violate trespassing rules or regulations, the Office of Student Conduct shall exercise reasonable discretion in pursuing cases where a student journalist's alleged violation occurred while engaging in news gathering activities. C, students are responsible for complying with the law and should strive to adhere to the canons of responsible journalism. No student shall publish or broadcast libelous or slanderous material or any other content that violates the law. While the SPJ, which is the Society of Professional Journalists Code of Ethics, may function as a baseline guide for responsible journalism practices, the Office of Student Conduct shall at no time make any determinations whether a student's conduct was responsible journalism. Their review should be limited to determining only if the student's own actions violated the university code of conduct. D, students may not be disciplined by the university for their participation in journalistic activities, except for violations of university rules that are not inconsistent with the rules guaranteed herein. E, in any case, the Office of Student Conduct elects to pursue in which a student has made an affirmative defense to the charges as a journalist, the office will appoint a faculty member from either the Graduate School of Journalism or a faculty member from the Berkeley Law School with experience in First Amendment law. In the event that a hearing is pursued, the Office of Student Conduct will appoint at least one student from either the Graduate School of Journalism or a member of the Daily Californian staff, which is the student newspaper on campus, to serve on the panel. So there's a panel with generally one faculty member, one staff member, and a student. And so I'm saying that one of this, and it can have up to 5 with 2 students, and I'm saying one of them should be a student journalist and that the faculty member should either be from the law school or the journalism school. Finally, F, all proceedings under the auspices of the Office of Student Conduct shall be governed by the provisions of the California Shield Law and under the common law reporter's privilege as recognized by the courts of this state, being California. As it turns out, the university revised, they went through a long task force process with all sorts of people meeting, I think, once a week or maybe once a month for an entire year to introduce a new code of conduct. And as it turns out, when this new code of conduct was introduced earlier this year, not surprising, none of these suggestions were implemented. So why should students, bloggers, and other independent journalists be afforded the same protections? If everyone is now a journalist, then surely we can't extend shield protections to everyone with a blog, a YouTube channel, or even a Facebook feed. Instead of protecting the journalist, I think we should seek to protect the journalism. Everyone can commit acts of journalism, but no one is always acting as a journalist. As the number of journalists on payroll continues to decline, more and more journalism will come from freelancers, students, and bloggers who are not necessarily afforded the same protections and certainly don't have the same resources to defend themselves. The chilling effect is real. More than a handful of my colleagues have shared that my experience served as a powerful cautionary tale, and that they've been discouraged from pursuing stories for fear that they'd find themselves caught in the same snares that I found myself in the past. And critics will often point to the fact that citizen journalists lack the accountability of their professional peers, and they might not even share the same set of ethics. But I think we can think of a few examples, and some have been raised this week, that not all professional journalists are exactly scrupulous, and that pretty much obliterates this idea that the professional journalist is a more reliable, more ethical source of information than the person who's volunteering to go out and share their perspective of the world. Now, with the future of a robust professional journalism industry so uncertain, I think we can all agree that no one knows what professional journalism is going to look like in the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years. I think it's imperative that all acts of journalism are protected, whether the reporter is working for a mainstream media outlet or out of his or her own passion to report on the world around them. Now, as you may have noticed, I neglected to use the word citizen journalism anywhere in this talk. And part of that reason is that I feel that citizen journalism is, in the term, is part of the problem. First off, all journalists are citizens of one country or another. So suggesting that there's citizen journalists and non-citizen journalists is kind of bizarre and threatens to say that journalists are sacrificing their role as citizens by becoming journalists, which is a perspective that some have suggested to me. Additionally to that, it's a sort of hyphenated term. You're not a journalist, you're a citizen journalist. It puts them into a different class of journalists, and I think that this is a dangerous territory to go down because we are all part of the free press, whether we be working for Time or Newsweek or the LA Times or just going on our own blog. And so I think that it's absolutely critical that we embrace all of us as journalists, whether we're professionals or bloggers or students who are learning to become professional journalists. And if they are not empowered with the same protections, then how can we expect them to perform at the same level and take the same risks that they are going to have to as they move forward in their professional careers? So with that, I want to go ahead and conclude with a brief haiku. I guess all haikus are going to be brief. That came to me while I was reflecting on this conference the other night. Without revenue, journalism will falter. And democracy? Thank you.
Thank you too, Josh. A presentation with a haiku, very nice. With a hyphenated citizen journalist. You're urging caution about the use of the term citizen journalist, which I think is very interesting and very relevant. The one question I have from you, for you, from my position, is that earlier, Louis Foch said the following. He said, the good thing about journalism in the present day and age is that it's a profession that can be exercised by millions of people all over the world. And I thought it was interesting the use of the word profession, because profession implies that you have an income. And we've also had the issue of, we've been talking about investigative journalism, and Joel Matthewson was pointing out that one element of investigative journalism is that you might engage in a story for an awful long period of time, and then it might come to naught. And I'm really interested in your opinion, because I am troubled about the fact that a journalist can, in many ways, or it certainly helps a journalist to be courageous and to be tenacious, to have an income that allows the journalist to be a professional journalist. What are your thoughts on all that?
I mean, I think that I'm inclined to say that journalism is a craft as opposed to a profession, because there are many people who are practicing the craft of journalism who are not professional journalists. So it's that term feels more comfortable to me. But at the same time, I definitely think that there is very limited abilities for journalists who have a 9-to-5 job that's completely unrelated to what they're doing to pursue stories. As you mentioned, investigative work can take hundreds and hundreds of hours in doling through all sorts of data and then perhaps not even revealing a story at all. And how can we expect people to have that time, have the opportunity to attend these city council meetings or governmental meetings that would generally clash with their life schedule if we don't have people being paid. Furthermore, citizen journalism, as it's known, there was a mention of journalism of interest, and it's definitely true that citizen journalism is journalism of interest. No amateur volunteer journalist is going to report on a story they have no interest in. And oftentimes you can find the interest in it, but people see something and that's their niche and they follow it. Whereas there's a lot of important information happening that the public needs to know about that probably isn't particularly tantalizing to any journalist to pursue. The first example that comes to my mind is garbage contract negotiations. A lot of people care about how much their garbage bill is going to go up or their water bill. But if you've ever sat through a waste management meeting, especially as they're talking about contracts, you know that it's not something you really want to go to unless you're being paid to be there. So I think there's a lot of journalism that we'll never see fulfilled through non-professional channels.
Questions?
Hate to keep being the one to pop up, but knowing so many of the people at UC Berkeley's Graduate School of Journalism, where were these faculty members when it came to supporting you? Or did they support you and get nowhere?
So there was definitely support from the Graduate School of Journalism. As I pointed out, they paid to send me here. So they definitely stood up. The dean at the time, Neil Henry, wrote a letter on my behalf. And in fact, basically what happened is when this first came about, everyone was issued this, you could call it like a plea bargain, that if I took responsibility for the charges, they'd let me off with just a 1-semester suspension. And the dean wrote a letter saying that that was absurd. And then I sent a letter to a mailing list of journalists asking for advice on other schools that have code of conducts that protect journalists. And of course, even though it was mostly educators on that list, it's a list of journalists. And the next thing I know, the New York Times is calling me for their local blog asking me about this situation. And within 5 minutes of that, the Chronicle was calling me and asking me about the situation. And both were online within a day or two. And they immediately call me back in and say, they have the article. They're like, okay, we believe you're a journalist now. Why don't you plead guilty to the charges, and instead of a suspension, we'll just let you off with a warning. And I'm like, but I've done nothing to endanger the health and safety of the university, which was one of many charges that I was facing, and I'm not about to plead guilty to something I didn't do for the sake of making this go away, even though I really couldn't care about a warning that, yeah, I wasn't concerned about the warning. But the dean definitely did stand up at that point in time. He took a leave of absence shortly thereafter, and we were left with sort of a group of people functioning as the dean. And when dealing with these sorts of sensitive and complicated issues, I think having a single leader is a much easier place to rally support than when you have a coalition of leadership at a journalism school.
Any other further comments? Yes.
Hi, Josh. Thanks for your speech. I was not expecting this because I have been experienced the same situation. I'm a student of a master in communication in Denmark. And one of the things I had to do research on because of another student that had the same situation as you found yourself in. And I wrote to the United Nations asking about what is the difference between journalists and bloggers, and what is the difference of citizen journalists. I did not get any answer from the United Nations yet, but I found out by myself. And the answer is there on Article 19 of the Convention on Human Rights, the Declaration of Human Rights, that every person that reports or do journalism of any kind is a journalist. So everybody that reports news is under the protection of the Declaration of Human Rights. So you as well. So you do not have to go through all these problems that you have faced, you know, if they respected the Declaration of Human Rights. Simple as that. Article 19. And I hope everybody will take this convention everywhere because we need that. I have been there in the same situation. Thank you.
I mean, I definitely agree that the Declaration of Human Rights establishes a lot of protections in the United States that just don't exist. Journalism being probably the least of which. But I should point out that the U.S. attorney, when I was fighting the case over shield law protections that don't exist for journalists in the first place, the U.S. attorney, while I was in prison, made the case that I am only a journalist in my own mind, and that through continued incarceration, I would be convinced to realize that I am nothing more than a kid with a camera. And I don't think he called me a kid with a camera, but that was the general takeaway. And this struck me as absurd to think that anyone imprisoned for their views is going to drop those views by the process of being incarcerated. You just don't hear about political prisoners having transformations and joining the other side because of incarceration. So there's definitely a debate that continues in the United States as to who is and who isn't a journalist. Most recently, a court in the state of Michigan has ruled that a blogger of a major tech blog is not a journalist under that state's shield law, although that blogger is in California and would be protected in the state of California, but it's a case of sort of working on the venues, and in Michigan, this lower level court has said that bloggers are not part of the press.
I'd like to ask a question, because I think that just saying that everybody is protected under Article 19 is a bit not enough, and the issue is actually a bit more complicated, because if you say that, and I think that making this distinction between who's journalist and who's not journalist, especially with regard to online communication, is a complicated and very up-to-date problem. But because if you want to have all the privileges that journalists have, you also, I guess, have to accept all the obligations. That in many countries, that mean that, for example, you have to register your press title. That means that you have to publish corrections, rectifications. That means that you have to authorize interviews and statements that are given by the people who you interview. So I'm not sure if all the bloggers really actually wish to accept that. There is not, the Polish government came with this proposal of a solution, and I'm actually curious about your opinion on that. It said that we can make this distinction by giving the online journalist the, let's say, optional right to register. And if they register, that means they have all the privileges and all the obligations. And if they don't register, they can be they can stay anonymous. They don't have to fulfill all the obligations, but then they also can benefit from the benefits, from the privileges. What do you think?
So I'm gonna go rather U.S.-centric here, and that in the United States there is very, very little government regulation of the press, and pretty much in fact it's almost explicitly interpreted from the First Amendment. The only avenue that you see sort of government regulation of journalists is in the form of press passes, and what press passes offer is quite limited in of itself, and doesn't dive into the area that you're talking about. So I'm opposed to that sort of regulation of the professional journalist for the most part, primarily from my background of the idea of complete separation of the press and the government, and there is no sort of regulation, and I support the lack of regulation because I think that the alternative offers too many potentials for abuse.
I'd like to ask a question, Josh. And to my mind, what you have been through sounds very complicated and highfalutin. In terms of Britain, I'm not sure that you would have been treated the same way in Britain, because to my mind, there is a distinction between a journalist and a reporter. And as a journalist, in my mind, and in my way of thinking, and correct me if I'm wrong, if you go to school, you go to journalism school, you study writing as a profession, a journalistic profession, then you are a journalist. But when you are a reporter, which I believe what many of these citizen journalists are, then it's a totally another different sphere. Or am I thinking two-way outside the box?
I mean, I've never been to Britain. I don't know enough about the UK's press system to have a sense of a separation between a reporter and a journalist. I know that most of the people I know who are working reporters prefer the term reporter or news person over journalist, because journalist is perceived to carry sort of a rather more highfalutin, as you said earlier, connotations with it. But that doesn't make them less journalists. It just kind of is the way that they carry themselves. I think that basically, from my perspective, we're talking about creating journalism, whether we're either way. And if you're making journalism, it seems to me you're a journalist as well as a reporter. I feel the terms are essentially interchangeably.
Josh, thank you very much for sharing your observations with us and your story. It was absolutely fascinating. Yeah, thank you. Yeah.